call to order the October 28th, 2019 regular business meeting of the Waynesboro City Council and ask Ms. Anderson if you wouldn't mind leading us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great, thank you. I'd ask those that if you'd like to speak this evening, we'd love to hear from you. There's a citizen comment sign-up sheet in the back corner of the room, and would ask that you please sign in. First on the agenda this evening is a motion to adopt the agenda as presented for tonight's meeting. Is there such a motion?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Number 3 is consideration of the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. The next is matters from council members. Does anyone have anything they'd like to share this evening?
Mr. Mayor, just as a reminder that first Tuesday of the month is when I hold my open meeting over at the French Press at 9 a.m. And that will be next Tuesday, which is that'll be out 5th, I believe.
Yes.
So just getting that out there, let people know, and I'll see you then.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Just share, since apologize for my absence to the last meeting. I was celebrating our 20th wedding anniversary. So, prior to that, week prior, I attended the Virginia Municipal League Conference down in Roanoke, and where I think we were well represented and had a very engaging conversation with legislators across the Commonwealth as well as counterparts and such. So it was an informed and positive event. Then, of course, we had our joint school board council meeting. Also attended the Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission. I've got a packet for everyone. I'll leave it in your mailboxes of a just sort of an informative snapshot of our region that's fairly current with demographics for the entire state and Augusta-Waynesboro region. So it's an important organization that does high-quality work, and appreciate their efforts. And so I thought that might be helpful and informative for folks to sort of see. The next was the other evening, attended just an amazing event over at Kate Collins Middle School, which is our third annual inclusion fair. That was initiated out of, I believe, Winona Elementary, and has grown so large that they had 35 different service organizations over at Kate Collins. It was truly an impressive event. I rolled in. You never know what to expect in the parking lot, and that parking lot was full to the brim of people from all over the region. And I certainly want to extend our thanks to, my thanks to the organizers for the event, because it was really, really worthwhile. So that's all I had. Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
I had to confirm the date, but the library has partnered with the Wayne Theater. We're partnering with them to show a screening, or have a screening of The Public. It's a fictional drama that really focuses on homelessness in the library systems. So we have partnered with the Wayne Theater. That's happening on November the 7th. And I believe it's at 6 p.m. It's in their playbill, so I apologize for not having that correct time. But we hope the public will show up to that, and, also to hear the panel discuss, just homelessness in our area and how we could, just how we can, I guess, attack it in a sense of, improving and, getting people off the streets and then hopefully into a shelter or into a permanent home situation.
That's awesome, thank you. And maybe that's something we could maybe create a Facebook event for, Mr. Ham?
I think so.
Okay, that'd be great, thank you. Thanks, Elsie. Number 5 is to proclaim Saturday, November 30th, 2019 as Small Business Saturday in the city of Waynesboro, thereby promoting and encouraging shopping at locally and independently owned businesses. So with that, I have the proclamation. If I have that readily, do you have a copy of it, Mike? Readily?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Please.
So I'll just read that proclamation. Whereas the city of Waynesboro celebrates our local small businesses and the contributions they make to our local economy and community. According to the United States Small Business Administration, there are currently 30.2 million small businesses in the United States. They represent 99.7% of all businesses with employees in the United States. And they're responsible for 65.9% of net jobs created from 2000 to 2017. And whereas small businesses employ 47.5% of the employees in the private sector of the United States, and whereas 94% of consumers in the United States value the contribution small businesses make in their community, and whereas 96% of consumers who plan to shop on Small Business Saturday said the day inspires them to go to small, independently owned retailers or restaurants, like in downtown Waynesboro and the like, that they have not been to before or would not have otherwise tried. And whereas 92% of companies planning promotions on Small Business Saturday said the day helps their business stand out during the busy holiday shopping season. And whereas 59% of small business owners said Small Business Saturday contributes significantly to their holiday sales each year. And whereas Waynesboro, Virginia supports our local businesses that create jobs, boost our local economy, and preserve our communities. And whereas advocacy groups, as well as public and private organizations across the country, have endorsed the Saturday after Thanksgiving as Small Business Saturday. Now, therefore, I, Terry Short, Mayor of the City of Waynesboro, do hereby proclaim November 30th, 2019 as Small Business Saturday. So we've got that proclamation and wanted to see if I could get a motion to approve.
I'll make that motion.
Great, thank you. Is there a second?
I will second it.
Thank you. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Next is to receive a report from SCS Engineers regarding an evaluation of the city's solid waste collection, disposal, and recycling systems. Mr. Shaw.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, earlier this year, the City of Waynesboro contracted with SCS Consulting Engineers to evaluate the efficiency and effectiveness of our solid waste and recycling materials collection systems and to assess whether revenues generated primarily from weekly refuse collection fees will be sufficient to sustain the city's programs over time. The evaluation takes a comprehensive look at the full range of city solid waste activities, including the weekly refuse collection service, bulk pickup service, recycling, as well as local landfill post-closure activities and our ongoing relationship at the Augusta County Service Authority landfill in Jollyview. The evaluation included 3 principal tasks. 1, to evaluate the efficiency of the city's existing solid waste collection system and recycling program. 2, to conduct a solid waste rate study, including a break-even analysis of revenues, cost, and possible modifications to the current program funding structure or fees. And finally, to evaluate the feasibility of a hypothetical scenario in which we would privatize the city's existing waste collection programs. There's no action required of the council at this evening. Primarily, this is informational, but there certainly are potential budget implications as we look to the future. Representatives from SCS will provide the overview with us this evening are Mr. Robert Dick, who's the project director, and Ryan Duncan, who is the project manager. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Dick.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Bob Dick. It's welcome the opportunity to present our study to you this evening. I'm joined by my colleague Ryan, who was instrumental in the study and developing the evaluation, along with other members of the SCS team. As Mr. Shaw mentioned, This was a comprehensive evaluation and consideration of multifaceted aspects of the solid waste and recycling system for the city. I understand it's the first one of its kind that's been done perhaps in a number of decades. And so the challenge here is for us to spend, Ryan and I, to spend 10 to 15 minutes and try to download that type of information to you. But I do welcome the opportunity. If you have any questions as I go along, please feel free to interject. The city staff involved in refuse collection and manning the drop-off center, bulk waste, and brush pickup have a lot of logistical complexities to deal with in order to provide environmentally responsible solid waste collections and ultimately disposal currently at the Augusta Regional Landfill. But I think of these in four broad categories, and that being residential curbside collection of waste, refuse. There's 3 rear loader trucks that go Monday through Thursday based on the ward system within the city. There's limited commercial curbside collections, so there are some businesses that opt to utilize the city's refuse collection program. There's a recycling drop-off center where recyclable materials that are intended to be recovered from the waste stream can be delivered by the citizens, the generator. And then there's what we term bulk waste and yard waste or brush pickup collection, which uses a different type of vehicle. One unique aspect about the city of Waynesboro that may be somewhat atypical from some of your peer cities within the Commonwealth of Virginia is currently, per your ordinance, residents do not have to utilize the city refuse collection, so it's optional. A resident can opt to utilize the city. A resident can also opt to utilize a private sector hauler, in which case they are not a customer of the city's refuse collection program. Mr. Shaw mentioned the Augusta Regional Landfill by the Augusta County Service Authority that manages that facility. Right now, 2 considerations to point out for the regional landfill is that the city of Waynesboro shares the costs in capital expenditure, and of course the authority operates that, and there's no cost to dispose of the city's waste at that facility that's being attributed to or accounted to the refuse fund. When I use the term refuse fund, I'm talking about the city's enterprise fund. So certainly there's no direct docking of disposal directly to the refuse fund. Throughout my presentation, I'll try to use the vernacular regional landfill when I'm talking about this facility. You'll also hear both Ryan and myself refer to another landfill facility. That's the closed City of Waynesboro landfill, and so I'll try to use the vernacular city landfill when we're talking about that. The study objectives here, Mr. Shaw kind of went through the 3 elements that SCS was tasked to do or perform. Our 3 activities. One was an evaluation of the efficiency and effectiveness of the collections and recycling system. We're analyzing a hypothetical consideration of privatization or outsourcing. This was more of a theoretical exercise in order to assess that potential scenario. And then we conducted a thorough customer survey that Ryan will explain what was done and what some of the results were. And then to develop a financial management plan that would consider consolidating the solid waste funding all into that single enterprise fund, that refuse fund. Right now, certain aspects of the city landfill post-closure care and the regional landfill are being handled or addressed outside of the refuse fund. Also to consider and make provisions for capital reserve requirements, that's equipment and rolling stock replacements, and then obviously trying to minimize the potential need for any rate increases to the customers. With that, I'm going to let Ryan, who really led the the initiative along with his team talk about what was uncovered and what SCS observed and what our findings were as far as the actual materials collection, evaluation, and that customer survey.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you to the council for the opportunity to speak. I'll just straight up start with saying the overall collections and recycling system has a very efficient and effective operations. That was a key finding of the overall study. There weren't any glaring deficiencies or outright reasons to consider the collections program deficient. There were some issues that were pretty prominent with the current bulk and brush program, especially with set-outs and some of the processes that are used to collect the piles of material set out on the curb for that particular program. But these are typical program issues with a lot of the cities in Virginia that we see. The overall weekly traditional curbside refuse collection indicated that the operations were working fairly efficiently. We looked at a couple different aspects, including the background information that was shared with us by the city. We interviewed staff and we conducted field reconnaissance and field evaluations by riding behind the vehicles. And overall, it seemed like that was a pretty efficient system. There did appear, after a scalehouse record analysis, for there to possibly be some room for an in-house route tweaking study to get a little bit more efficiencies and balancing. But it might not be the most cost-effective thing in a small locality to do that, since your system that has the routes by ward it seems to be working pretty efficiently right now. The recycling and diversion program is now a cost center. We found that there are costs to the collection of recyclable material from the drop-off material. Historically, it's been more of a revenue generator, but due to macroeconomic conditions and China trade policies, the cost and the value created by materials seems to be going down. And so that's a consideration that was key. And we did look into the feasibility and the potential for curbside recycling collection and enhanced organics management through potentially a compost facility in-house, and both of those did not seem viable at the time, primarily because of the issue I said before and the lack of economies of scale for composting. A little bit deeper look into that bulk waste. You can see from the pictures we took, just a single or two route during a day or two evaluation, we saw a lot of examples of the abuses of the system. I'll go ahead and say there is ordinances in the city code that explicitly dictates procedures for putting neat piles that are size limited at the edge of the street for collection. A lot of this wasn't being adhered to by customers, and so it does incur some burden onto the refuse staff for collection of the material. You can see there's mixing of brush and bulk in some cases, and traditional refuse being mixed in with what was intended as bulky refuse, and the bulky refuse itself was found to be not containerized or tidally piled for the ease of picking up with the lifts that are used in the bulk and brush program. So one of our key recommendations from the materials collection evaluation was to potentially hire a half-time customer service representative that would handle both enforcement and education and outreach and enhance those activities, which would probably have a large payback based on some of the stuff we were seeing. There's also an issue with traditional curbside weekly collection where the practice of snow coning goes on, and that's the piling of material over the top of the bin, and it ends up strewn on the street occasionally with winds and rodents. Overall, though, we did an outsourcing analysis as well as the customer satisfaction survey. Both were done mostly for reference purposes. We looked at advantages and disadvantages for the potential for outsourcing, a sample implementation plan, and did some benchmarking with peer institutions and other institutions for which we had data. The survey results seem to indicate overall high satisfaction with refuse. You can tell by the quantitative example there, but there's other data available in addition to these other findings that were shared by a few folks. The survey was about 150 citizens and was not done as a scientific comprehensive survey, but certainly provides insight into the level of satisfaction and some of the key issues from the customers. So I'll hand it back to Bob to talk about the revenue sufficiency analysis.
Right now, the revenue that the enterprise fund receives is for those residents and businesses that opt in to be serviced for refuse collection by the city's program. They're paying $14.50 per month per household. And so some of the key issues as we instituted a modeling of what I'm going to run through here are three different scenarios to assess the sufficiency of that enterprise fund. A couple things to keep in mind. One is historically the city's landfill, the closed City of Waynesboro landfill, is still in the post-closure care monitoring phase as required by the Commonwealth's regulations for solid waste. And there's expenditures that are being incurred by the city for that facility, and that's being paid out of the general fund historically. There's also a program of vehicle replacements that is ongoing, and so we introduced the plan. We coordinated with city staff to understand what vehicles and equipment were planned to be purchased and replaced. I mentioned the Augusta Regional Landfill. It has new cells, new disposal units that need to be constructed and lined. It also has other infrastructure for environmental control systems and capping or closure of the cells, disposal units at that facility as they achieve final elevation. And all those things impose the need for periodic infusion of money to the authority or to that facility that come out have historically not been covered by the enterprise fund. And then Ryan mentioned it, but one of the things that we're hearing often from progressive minded cities and citizens are, hey, what's going on with recycling? Well, our industry, our solid waste and recycling, for those of you that aren't deep into this aspect of this industry, have been rocked recently, just completely disrupted is one of the terms I hear, by some procedures and policies from international markets not accepting our recovered materials, our recyclables. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. All these things, the key takeaway is these all put pressure on the rate that is currently active here with the city. So the first scenario we looked at was what I call baseline. You might term it business as usual. BAU is often the acronym used. And so we essentially looked at beginning fund balances as of June 2018. We informed those balances by the year that's already passed, the fiscal year 2019 budget and actual expenditures, and then the fiscal year 2020, what we're currently in as far as the city's budgets. And so that made some minor modifications to our model. I mentioned that 5-year vehicle replacement plan that was introduced in there as well, and looked at some growth projections for the account. And the one key aspect of this baseline scenario was that there was no change or consideration for changing the structure of how the accounting for various costs is happening right now. In other words, the city landfill post-closure funding would continue out of the general fund, and there would be no introduction of the Augusta Regional Landfill periodic capital expenditures into the enterprise fund. And so the takeaway from this baseline scenario is that the results indicated that by maintaining that current rate of $14.50 per month per household, you would yield insufficient fund balance by 2022. In other words, by introducing inflationary costs on the expenditures, introducing the 5-year vehicle capital replacement plan, but maintaining a consistent rate that didn't get escalated over the next 5 years, we would diminish the current reserve balance in that fund. And so That brought about the need to look at scenario number 2. And so in a nutshell, scenario number 2 introduces or includes the closed city landfill expenditures for that post-closure care monitoring as a enterprise refuse fund expenditure, and maintains everything else the same as the baseline, and does not consider burdening the enterprise fund with the capital, periodic capital expenses at the Augusta Regional Landfill. And so what the model does is calculate the corresponding fee adjustments. And so what you see here is potentially the need to introduce increased rates for that solid waste collection fee from the current value of $14.50 in order to maintain adequate capital reserves into the future. Scenario 3 built upon the idea of both the baseline and scenario 2, but it looks at enabling the enterprise funding to the enterprise fund to build up the monies that will be necessary at the regional landfill for periodic capital expenditures. And so it also, essentially what it's doing is consolidating all the solid waste expenditures, both the operation of the city's refuse program, the CapEx involved in vehicle replacement, the city landfill post-closure care monitoring, and the periodic CapEx at the regional landfill into a consolidated enterprise fund. And those values, as you would expect, with the introduction of the regional landfill CapEx, are slightly more than scenario number 2, which of course was more than business as usual scenario 1. Another part of our report, moving away from the financial analysis, the revenue sufficiency analysis, but also somewhat tied, I can anticipate that one of your questions might be, hey, how do we benchmark compared to some of our peer cities within the Commonwealth? And so the report that we developed includes a rather rigorous section on benchmarking against several cities. And the one thing to highlight here, while you see that the Waynesboro rate of $14.50 is somewhat lower than a few, it does potentially look like it's more significant and significantly higher than at least 2 municipalities. What we need to communicate there's some qualifying statements that need to be made. Specifically, we have knowledge that both of those municipalities have rather substantial subsidies that are coming from the general fund in order to do that. One thing about Commonwealth of Virginia municipalities is nobody quite has the same puzzle or formula for how to fund solid waste and recycling, so it is difficult to always look at a chart like this and know that you're comparing apples to apples. And so one thing I would leave you with is that those 2 municipalities that appear to be substantially lower are utilizing general fund monies from property tax assessments to subsidize their actual costs. With that, let me try to summarize our key findings here. As Ryan mentioned, we found no major deficiencies and thought that the city staff are doing a relatively efficient and effective operation, and that was reflected in a lot of positive comments from the customer base there. One comment that we did have specifically to what we call abuses of the systems or misbehavior by customers, some of which is probably due to them not being informed of the ordinance and policies, and some of which, a small percentage, are by systemic chronic bad behavior by a few, that being snow coning and bulk and brush, which impose a tremendous imposition and costs on the system. And so we recommend adding a customer service representative whose main focus is to address that, and we think that'll pay substantial dividends as an investment. We looked at and considered curbside recycling program or potentially a city composting organics management separately. We do not recommend that at this time. Both of those ideas or concepts and initiatives would come with substantial costs. So unless the city is prepared to make that decision to incur substantial costs, we don't believe that this is the appropriate time to engage in those initiatives. From a financial standpoint, we recommend that the city restructure some of the manner in which the cost accounting is being handled, and such that all solid waste and recycling costs are consolidated and basically addressed in that refuse fund, and that a 5-year plan of rate adjustments. SES isn't recommending any particular numerical value, but we do want to inform you that the city needs to take some sort of action in consideration. Otherwise, there will be an issue with insufficient fund balance in the reserve fund shortly, and then probably address it every 1 to 2 years, because specifically the Augusta County Service Authority's periodic capital needs are being communicated to the city, and oftentimes they change. Thank you so much for your attention and interest in this subject. Ryan and I will be happy to address any questions.
Any questions?
How was the survey handed out, or to whom was it handed out to?
The survey was distributed at local festivals.
Okay.
I believe 2 or 3 of them, both in hard copy and through an app through the city website. I believe so, digitally, and I think there was about 30 hard copies.
And this information may be in the packet that you gave us. How many current customers do we have?
That number, I believe, is around 7,000 or so.
Households?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
In your packet here, I was reading it, it talks about whole house cleanouts by landlords. Is there something in our ordinances or something that suggests that they should have it picked up commercially?
I do not believe that ordinance is in effect right now, but
But is that something you were recommending?
I don't believe we put that in there. There might have been a commentary on it somewhere in the larger scale recommendations.
Is that something you would recommend?
I think so. One of the challenges is to really, based on the material, it's sometimes difficult to assess what is a landlord set out of a tenant's possessions versus when somebody has legitimately had a major remodeling project or something like that. So we do believe that true tenant or landlord set-outs are a result of a commercial endeavor by them and should not be picked up by the city's tab, essentially, by providing refuse service to citizens. But we do acknowledge that sometimes the discernment of what constitutes a set-out from a tenant and a landlord versus what is just a very significant bulk and brush set-out by a resident legitimately, that's a hard decision sometime for the equipment operator, the vehicle driver to make.
Thank you.
I have a question, but it might be more for staff. But what are we taking out of the general fund now to put into the post-closure?
Generally runs about $175,000, sometimes to over $200,000 a year. And it varies a little bit depending on requirements in that particular year of the DEQ. In other words, in recent years, we've been required to drill additional test wells, and so that can be a $30,000 or $40,000 investment, but typically around $200,000 a year.
So if we was to move it out of the general fund and put it over into the enterprise fund, we'd have whatever we normally were spending, extra money sitting there. Is there an easy way we could transfer that money over into the enterprise fund so that there wouldn't have to be an increase, but there's more money there to pay for the job?
Yes, I think essentially what SES is recommending would be that even if you continue to subsidize the refuse collection fund, you would you would reflect the cost in refuse collection, but if you said, we don't want to charge the refuse customer for that, you would do a transfer from the general fund over. Is that essentially the?
Yes. Yeah, and that transfer from the general fund would provide an infusion of monies that would increase the balance of the fund and potentially defer a portion of the need for rate increases.
Because I see the closed landfill as a city problem. It's something that we have to take care of. We have no options on that. But when you get over into the enterprise, then it's a personal choice of whether or not you want to let the city pick your trash up or pay somebody else. I'm just trying to think how it would be fair if we move it all over to enterprise, and then the only people paying for it are the trash customers, but they're also paying for a city problem over here, and we're kind of penalizing our trash customers for the whole burden of that, as opposed to having it spread out to everybody in the city. Does that make sense?
It is something we discussed, and maybe I'd let these gentlemen, they work with the industry, give us their perspective, but it definitely was an issue that we raised, one of equity is who should pay. And
Yeah, we had extensive discussions about that. One thing to point out, I guess to keep in mind, is that the substantial majority of the residents do select the city. I don't know, do we have in our report the actual number or percentage? But I think you have to think that the majority of households are selecting the city's service as opposed to a private sector hauler. We totally do understand that the post-closure care of the city closed landfill historically was an issue where every individual, every household could have placed their waste in that facility. And now under the current ordinance, there are some portion of the citizens that are not your customers, not city customers. One of the challenges in a historical circumstance like that is it's always difficult to provide absolute equitable appropriation of monies for legacy facilities like that. Our recommendation, while we considered that, we stand by the idea that we think while it may not always have the appearance of absolute equity for who put their trash decades ago in one facility versus how it's being managed today, that would just be very difficult to be able to find a solution in which all parties would have a fair resolution of costs for legacy facilities as well as current facilities. One thing to point out is those customers that are opting for commercial services they are in theory paying for their portion of the regional landfill's CapEx through that private sector hauler. In other words, that private sector hauler is showing up at the regional landfill and paying a tip fee, which the city customers, at least from the enterprise fund, don't get taxed with. I know that was a long-winded answer to your question, but I guess ultimately we weren't able to identify a simplistic solution to the equity issue.
I'd ask you a question, and maybe you can or can't answer it, but if you were king of the day and you got to pick if we wanted to make everybody become a city customer or leave it the system we have, with what you know about our system and the financing and the running of it, what would you do?
Well, I think one thing that would inform my decision on that and provide context is that the city has navigated all of the pressures on solid waste and recycling with their program such that it still appears to be the most economically beneficial for the majority of the residents. So although I do think that I work at other cities in which it's mandatory, and that does provide obviously more revenue, and that might be a more easy system to manage. Actually, if I were king for the day, I probably would not make the change because it seems seems to be working for the city of Waynesboro.
Thank you.
But you got anything, if you were king for the day, would you
No, I
have
tend
a
to
different,
agree. Yeah.
different answer?
What about our recycle center over there? I know it used to be where we made some money off of it, now we're losing money, and I think there's something on the agenda tonight about us having to supplement it again. Is that a thing, from a business viewpoint, is it worth our while for us to continue to do it or not?
Well, one thing we did discuss in conversations was the attendant that's cited on Saturdays, I believe. Perhaps going to a full-time attendant or having a little bit more control over the actual stream and more enforcement there. Choosing materials that perhaps are most beneficial from both an economic and environmental standpoint to divert would be probably most optimal for a recycle drop-off center.
Yeah, I think whether you stay in the business of providing that particular aspect for recycling, we do think that there's no need at this time to eliminate it because it is the only potential facility that citizens have to utilize if they want to recycle. But you'll note that we also didn't recommend that you should expand that into multiple facilities because of the costs involved. The recycling markets will likely work themselves out as domestic paper mills get back up in business, but we're just in a rough time right now. So while we don't recommend that you close that facility to save costs, we also advocated that you don't entertain curbside recycling or expanding it to provide more facilities. I think Ryan mentioned we did have a suggestion of how to best tweak it to monitor against contamination of recyclables, which seems to be what so many of the issues are within the recycling industry.
Thank you.
A couple questions. Relative to, we've got a compensation study presently going for the municipal side of the organization. And certainly I understand that we've had some challenges, to say the least, relative to vacancies and such in our refuse department. So I'm curious. I would absolutely agree with you 100%. I think we have an outstanding leadership and outstanding employees. But thinking back to the last year or two, and similar sorts of studies that you've done in other municipalities, explain to me what the circumstances would have to look like for you to make a recommendation for outsourcing.
I think for us to make a recommendation to outsource, one, we would have had to uncover some degree, substantially increased degree of dysfunctionality within the operations of the current system. So something that introduced a rather high level of dissatisfaction where refuse wasn't getting collected and there was rather substantial dysfunction by the crews, and I say that to distinguish that from just abuses by the customers or generators or misbehaviors as it in the context of the ordinances. So I think that would have to be one thing. I think another would have to be within the enterprise fund seeing year-over-year deficits. In other words, if you always ended up in the red every year and we're having to infuse monies from the general fund and cover substantial deficits, and frankly, you're not having that. But I need to qualify that statement and say, consider that some of your other solid waste and recycling related expenditures are being covered by general fund monies.
Well, that's kind of my point. If $175,000 to $200,000 plus the cost of the deficit we're running on the recycling, plus additional labor resources, financial labor resources that we're going to need to provide for salaries. I was trying to understand the circumstances. Not that I'm advocating for it,
Right. No,
but just more so. I think that there are folks in the community that ask these questions. And so I think it just, since we've got you here to,
Well, and I think another thing to add to that is, in the context of that benchmarking, if the city of Waynesboro seemed to be chronically at the top of the scale, and to indicate that in addition to tangible dysfunctionalities and deficits, but that the fees that would need to be imposed to make the enterprise fund solvent put you out of the range of what's typical or normal, then that would be another indicator that perhaps privatization could be a potential solution or need to be further considered as an option.
because at year 5, in your scenario 3, that puts us $3 and change over the highest municipality in your examples, and that's why I'm,
Yeah, well, one thing we like to make is you would assume that since there is inflationary increases built into our projections, then the other localities would also get those increases and
Great.
probably be above that.
okay, great. Thank you so much. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. Thank you so much. All right. Number 7 this evening is to consider adopting a resolution authorizing the execution of a funding agreement between the City of Waynesboro and the Waynesboro City Health Department.
So yes, sir. Section 32.1-31 of the Code of Virginia requires local health departments, such as the Waynesboro Health Department, and the local governing body, such as our city council, to execute annually a statement of agreement establishing and documenting responsibilities, annual financial contribution, and services to be provided to the locality by the local health department. This is an annual activity, and it is somewhat unusual that each year we accomplish this nearly a quarter into the fiscal year. But this agreement simply documents the service program anticipated by the Waynesboro Health Department and the financial contribution the locality will make for those services. Services provided by the health department are shared between the locality and the Commonwealth according to state code. And as indicated, our contribution this year will be between $214,000, $215,000 or $211,000. We expect some adjustment there. Having said that, unless there are questions from council, you're asked to consider simply a resolution authorizing the execution of the funding agreement before the City of Waynesboro, between the City of Waynesboro and the Waynesboro Health Department.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Hamp? Is there a motion to adopt the resolution?
I'll make it.
Okay, thank you. And is there a second?
I'll second it.
Great, thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Number 8 is to receive information regarding a proposed stream bank remediation under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act in North Park and consider adopting a resolution approving a temporary easement for the subject work. Mr. Hamp.
Yes, sir. Mr. Mayor, members of council, you are very likely aware that DuPont has undertaken several remediation projects along the South River in our community, and several of which have occurred on property owned by the City of Waynesboro. As work is concluding on the most recent project in the vicinity of Shiloh Baptist Church and Riverside Drive, the organization is planning and preparing to undertake the next round of remediation in the North Park area. This evening, you're asked to consider a resolution authorizing the necessary construction easements, and I'll take the opportunity to remind you that the subsequent maintenance and ongoing care for the remediation areas are the responsibility of DuPont going forward, or Corteva. Mr. Liberati can clarify that in his presentation. And the terms have been worked through, as we have in the past. The staff have worked to establish a communicative and cooperative relationship, seeking at once to strike a balance between wanting to facilitate the remediation of the ground, but also not wanting to be careless with potential impacts and future uses and enjoyment of city property. And we think we've done that. In this case, I would draw the council's attention and to the public's attention to several key considerations that if the work is undertaken as contemplated, the aesthetic of North Park will change significantly and primarily around the riverbank. And also by virtue of removal or amendment or adjustment to the existing flood berm, the look in that regard will change also, but we think there are beneficial aspects to those changes which will be outlined in the presentation this evening. So I think Mr. Jones is going to do an introduction to both Mr. Michael Liberati, who is the principal project remediation project manager that oversees and has conducted these projects, and then the project elements itself. So Mr. Jones.
Mayor, members of council, it's my pleasure to be here, and I just wanted to just take a minute to just give a parks perspective. I've been working with the South River Science team, DuPont, and now Corteva over the course of several years because most of their work has taken place in our parks. And while we don't necessarily like the idea of removing trees, we've been working with them on the project in North Park for a number of months to develop a project we think is mutually beneficial. The relocation of the greenway near the river as a subsequent benefit of this project, we think in the short term, the loss of trees, but the long term will benefit the park itself. Again, we were not able to do that with the funding level from VDOT, but when this opportunity arose for them to be able to do the work, modify the bank, and then allow for closer access to the river. We've worked closely with them, and we feel, again, long range, this will be a great benefit to the city. And it is a final chapter in a very long and detailed book that we have been writing with them along the way. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Mike Liberati, who'll give you more detail, and I'm available at the end for questions as well.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to present the next phase of our remediation project. My name is Mike Liberati, and I'm the project director for the remediation activities. I actually work for a company called Corteva Agriscience. DuPont, the DuPont company, is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Corteva Agriscience company. So we are continuing to do this work as the DuPont company, because it still exists in Corteva. I thought I would first update you on the progress of our remediation project. We call phase one of the project the first 2 miles of the river. That's from the former DuPont plant down 2 miles of river, essentially to about Basic Park. In that 2 miles, we identified 6 riverbanks that are continuing to contribute mercury to the river system, and this contribution of mercury is keeping, we believe, the fish tissue elevated. And these 6 riverbanks we've calculated to contribute approximately 35 pounds of mercury a year. And it's our belief that if we successfully remediate the 6 riverbanks, we will be able to remove about 90% of that 35 pounds of mercury. This gauge to the right shows essentially 100% is 35 pounds of mercury removed. By completing these riverbank projects, we expect to remove about 90% of that mercury, keep about 90% of that mercury out of the river. So far, we've completed projects on the DuPont property, which we call the pilot bank, first project in 2011. And then we moved on to Constitution Park, then to City Shops, then to the Allied Ready Mix property across the river from City Shops. And we just recently completed the Shiloh Baptist Church. Each one of these projects, you can see their contribution of mercury to the system, with Shiloh, the last one we did, contributing about 25% of the mercury. This last riverbank, North Park, is contributing about 30% of the total load of mercury. So it's the largest and most mercury contributing piece of the project. Just a review of the riverbanks. This is Constitution Park. This is a photograph of when we completed it, and this was a photograph taken a couple weeks ago. So you see that these riverbanks, this was completed in 2016. These riverbanks revegetate very quickly. This is city shops completion and what it looks like today. And over time, these rock tows that we put in fact, in Constitution Park, you would not be able to find it. It gets silted in, and plants start growing within the rocks. And that's what's happening here at City Shops. This is the Allied Ready Mix property, end of construction to the left, and what it looks like today. And just a couple weeks ago, completed Shiloh Baptist Church and had the opportunity to put a greenway extension across the back of the church. This was our most challenging project to date because essentially from the greenway out to the river is constructed land. We made that land in lifts. And this project went behind Shiloh Church and down Riverside Avenue, hopefully to be continued to North Park. The North Park project has two riverbanks that we need to remediate. The river is flowing from the left to the right in this photograph, and we've designated them as the upstream bank management area and the downstream bank management area. Upstream area is about 1,200 linear feet, downstream is about 800 linear feet. The white line is our proposed construction roads. And in fact, the upper white line here is the current alignment of the greenway. Because the current riverbank system is not in a condition or shape to actually have the greenway placed on it, the greenway alignment was put into the back of the park. This is a blow-up of the downstream riverbank and our proposed construction roads here. And by doing this project, we're going to reshape this riverbank and to a point where we can put the greenway on top of the riverbank. And greenway users will have views of the riverbank and access to the river itself. This bank will be recontoured, and we plan to put in a step system and a kayak ramp, a river walk across this edge. There's a water feature in this location where sometimes during the years people use wakeboards in this area, and we figured that if we don't put a path down to it, a path is going to be created. So we will put a formal path so folks will be able to walk down to the river, walk across the rock toe, and then back up a path here. And we will also make a path from the existing parking lot to the canoe and kayak launch. The greenway will be connected up to Bridge Street. This is the concept for the canoe launch that we plan to build. This is actually the launch in Roanoke, Virginia. We will not put it, we plan to put in wooden steps instead of these concrete monstrosities, more natural looking wooden steps. And then this launch is such that you just load your kayak canoe onto these railings and slide it down as you walk down the steps. This diagram shows the limits of our construction around here, and then the placement of the greenway on top of the berm. The benefits from our remediation is not only will keep the mercury in these riverbanks from entering the river, but will also allow for realignment of the greenway system to be more connected to the river. And because the banks will be recontoured, it'll provide for additional recreational opportunities from park users and actually connect the river to the park to the river. If you go to North Park today and didn't know you were at the river, you'd never know the river was there because of the high berm and the tree cover. So this project will allow for that connection. You'll be standing in this location, you'll be able to see across that berm and into the river, and also walk there. And then, as I mentioned, the canoe and kayak access launch and the footpath will be put in. The upstream bank management area will be very much like the bank at Riverside Drive. So it will be a capping scenario and revegetation. Our plan is to, as much as possible, save and maintain healthy, mature trees. But in some instances, we actually have to move them out to get at the mercury. Our schedule is to start the downstream remediation near the baseball diamond in December. And we expect it to take about 6 months to complete. As soon as we finish the downstream, we will start on the upstream section. And that will take us through the fall and probably into early 2001. The downstream will be planted in the fall of next year, and the upstream will be planted in the fall of 2021. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm certainly available for any questions, as is Dwayne.
Any questions?
I've got a couple of questions. Thank you for the presentation. Give us a quick view on exactly what is going to happen with that bank. Is there you mentioned capping, is there a membrane that's placed over it and then new soil on top? Or are you actually removing soil, or what happens?
The berm, the top of berm right now is uneven. It's low in some places and high in other places. We will make it a uniform elevation. We'll take, it's very steep on the park side. We'll soften that slope so it's easy to walk up the berm. And our capping system involves putting a engineered geocell plastic. It looks like a plastic honeycomb that gets filled with a mixture of soil and biochar. And on top of that, we'll put lists of soil and topsoil and actually do plantings through that system, through the geocell systems of trees and shrubs.
So is there removal of the contaminated soil to start with, or just
Now,
capping?
this instance, removal, we've actually done these banks in two ways. We've removed areas, and we have just capped areas. We do removals when we have exceedingly high levels of mercury. This bank does not have that situation. There is one small area at the downstream extreme near Bridge Street, and it's an area approximately 20 feet in diameter. So it's very, very small removal. So this is a capping system.
And then I guess my other question was, and this is for Ms. Jones as well, how does that construction work in with the baseball season and everything else that's going to be going on down there?
Right. So the area will, in their construction zone, will be completely fenced off, and we've talked and worked with Mike on trying to have the least interruption. There will be some interruption in the spring season. There are construction hours and different things like that. They'll accommodate if we have a tournament or something like that. But there will be 6 to 8 foot construction fencing sort of encompassing their project all the way around to the entrance road while they're working on that bank. It is tight near the concession stand, and so that's allow for that work to take place. And again, their workday will shut down and we'll still be able to have Little League Baseball under the lights because they'll be gone. There will be a fence there, and it'll look different, but we're going to ensure the safety of the kids, and again, there won't be construction going on during baseball time.
Any other questions?
I've got a statement to throw out to the other council members. We sort of reviewed some of these pictures at the Parks and Rec Commission. And so I've got, a better sense maybe of what that will look like. And I guess the takeaway was for a park that currently does not have the river access that we have at Ridgeview, it's going to be more like that. There's going to be, ability to get down there, to launch your canoe or kayak. So I think, bringing the river into that park would be a great thing. Obviously, a season of disruption when it's going on, but I think in the long run, our takeaway was that will probably enhance that park a good bit.
Yeah, that's great insight. Thank you. Have we communicated the plans to the Waynesboro Youth Baseball?
We haven't in any detail. We wanted to get here first to make sure this all passed, and then once we have that, we'll put it together, a package for them to let them know how the season's going to be impacted.
Yeah, at least the fencing for the first year will help keep the balls out of the river, because I know that's a favorite pastime. So what happens with the construction road afterwards? And where I'm coming with this is that if you're coming from the neighborhoods up the hill, or otherwise, the crossing the park road when, parents and coaches and otherwise are all zooming out of there, it can be a little hairy to gain access to it. And again, I'm talking about a very small season of the year. So what happens with the construction road after it's all done?
So part of the recommendation on our behalf is that the construction road in the downstream section near the ball field, that become their haul road. So that becomes their construction road, so that those trucks will be going out by the bridge on 2nd Street. And then as they pull out and finish that, then that construction road will be the ground for the greenway. So in other words, they leave the gravel, the mat.
Oh, so the current greenway alignment is not in play at all?
Correct. And with these things, that greenway moves from sort of on the edge of the parking lot up to the berm. And again, we looked at that early on in the greenway process, but again, didn't want to. The other thing I should add to this, that we did have an independent study on the impact of the berm to make sure that there were no ill effects for city shops or North Park as far as flooding concerns, because that's why the berm was put in place. Their engineers, AECOM, and our independent engineers with Wiley Wilson determined that there's no because the berm is not high enough to protect us anyway, they're basically reshaping the berm to the lowest level that it's at. And so there's no ill effects or no increased risk to North Park because of the addition. But that haul road, in essence, once they're done, will ultimately be the trail of the greenway. So, minus the asphalt we tried.
Well, great. So is there a motion to adopt the resolution granting the easement?
So moved.
Great. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. All right, thank you, gentlemen. Number 10, number 9, is to consider adopting a resolution authorizing the creation of a 2020 Census Regional Joint Complete Count Committee with the City of Stanton and County of Augusta. Mr. Hamp.
Mayor Short, members of council, you may recall from a previous presentation concerning the upcoming 2020 census that participation is a point of emphasis for the Census Bureau. And we referenced at that time that the 3 localities, Waynesboro, Stanton, and Augusta County, would be joining forces through the facilitation with the Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission to form a complete count committee. And this resolution presented for your consideration tonight endorses that and approves our participation in that regional complete count committee.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Is there a motion to adopt?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Item number 10 is to consider adopting an ordinance appropriating Chesapeake Bay grant funds in the amount of $3,000 to the Stormwater Fund to purchase signage. Mr. Shaw.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, this is actually kind of fun. These are grant funds, as noted, but they're for educational purposes. For some years now, as part of our MS4 compliance, we are required to meet minimum pollution control measures, and one of those measures has to do with public education. And we satisfy that in part through outreach and programs that are conducted regularly in the Waynesboro Public Schools and at Fishburne. And so this program is going to allow that we put educational interpretive signage at the Wayne Hills Stormwater Detention Facility. And the program would allow that children as young as kindergartners could come and see the travels of Perry the Raindrop as he falls on the parking lot, makes his way to the pond, picks up oil and grit on the parking lot, travels down to the pond, deposits his oil and grit, becomes clean again, moves on down to the South River. And so the stormwater program coordinators here at the city have worked with teachers from Wayne Hills pre-K program up through Cape Collins to come up with this particular signage.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions? Is there a motion to adopt?
So moved.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Great. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Number 11 is to consider adopting an ordinance appropriating CDBG program income in the amount of $5,773 and the liquidation of the CDBG reserve account in the amount of $23,180 to the Capital Improvements Projects Fund for consulting services to develop a Port Republic Road, Florence Avenue neighborhood plan. Mr. Shaw.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, as I think several of you probably recall, during the spring, the city staff, members of council, had a meeting with Port Republic neighborhood citizens at the Rosenwald School to discuss community development block grant projects that we wanted to pursue in the neighborhood there, cleaning up and improving the cemetery, doing some cleanup on Elkton Street and so forth. And one of the requests that was made of the city was that we would pursue a neighborhood plan, an action plan for the historic neighborhood there. And so this proposal, we've requested an amendment to our CDBG annual action plan through HUD, and that's been approved. And so this is really the reappropriation of those funds to be able to pursue this neighborhood plan.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions? I'd just say that I'm certainly pleased to see this move forward. I think I've lamented to almost everybody, improving quality of neighborhoods, doubling down on our commitment to improving, being a partner in neighborhood revitalization is a difficult thing, and it's a long term, a long process. And while I, conceivably would prefer to perhaps see the money allocated towards actual projects, I also have now understood the value of developing a plan that we can refer to, and hopefully this council and future councils can align itself to advancing that plan and strategy. So just offer that. So is there a motion to adopt the ordinance?
I'll make it.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Great, thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Number 12 is to consider introducing an ordinance appropriating a portion of the net position in the refuse fund in the amount of $17,585 to the refuse fund for increased costs associated with recyclable material disposal. Mr. Shaw.
Mr. Mayor, members of council, as you're well aware, more than a year ago, it became less and less economically viable to recycle plastics. We did have a number of months where we were paying essentially to have plastics removed from the recycling center. and then we discontinued recycling of plastics. We continue to recycle paper and cardboard and metals at the recycling center, but even as it stands today, especially paper and cardboard are a cost to remove. And so the ordinance before you takes retained earnings of the refuse fund to cover the cost of that transport removal over, this is actually 11 months. We've used some funds that were already available to us. We still make a little bit of money on metals, but it's not nearly enough to offset the cost of removing cardboard and paper.
Any questions?
So what I understand that is this is retained earnings from the refuse fund that we are redistributing.
That's correct. The fund has a balance that carries from year to year based on any time that you have revenues that exceed expenditures. And so I think the fund balance there, I don't want to throw a bad number at you, but it's in the neighborhood of about $1 million. Is that?
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Is there a motion to adopt the ordinance?
So moved.
Great, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Good, thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Item 13 is to consider adopting an ordinance appropriating funds received from Bedford County in the amount of $3,793 to the general fund for reimbursement of travel expenditures in the police department. Mr. Hamp.
Unless there are questions, this is simply a reimbursement by grant that comes to us through Bedford County, who was the coordinating grant recipient and program coordinator. There's some training funded by the grant and appropriating that reimbursement.
Any questions? Is there a motion to adopt the ordinance?
Make a motion.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Great. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Number 14 is to consider introducing an ordinance appropriating a portion of the courthouse security restricted reserve in the amount of $1,135 to the general fund for a surveillance camera in the district court building. Mr. Hampton.
These security measures are recommended by Sheriff Joe Harris Jr. They're funded by the Courthouse Security Reserve. Unless there are additional questions, I think it is an unfortunate need to enhance recording ability to discourage bad behavior, and then if bad behavior occurs, to be able to record and prosecute it.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Is there a motion to introduce?
So moved.
Great. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Number 15 is communication, correspondence, and calendar.
I don't have anything this evening, sir.
Okay. Number 16 is citizen comment period. Do we have anybody signed up?
No one has signed up to speak.
Okay. So with that, we move to the next part of the agenda is a motion to adjourn.
I'll make it.
Great. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. We are adjourned.